Well, welcome back from lunch. So I've left you with the cliffhanger here. So, yeah, right. So just to review, because your lunch may be eating up your memory a bit, but just to take us and then to take us out of this cliffhanger and to start to land this plane. So just think of secular zero as a world before the secular. And again, why that's really important for us is I just want us to recognize whatever we call the secular in relation, particularly to our Western societies, it comes out of a time where there was no secular. So that whatever the secular is, it is born out of that reality. Secular one's public-private divide. Secular two is what sociologists will often call the secularization theory. And some of you studied sociology maybe in the 80s or the 90s. There used to be a very kind of dogmatically held sociological theory that simply the more modern a society you would get, the more it would just simply throw off religion. And for the most part in sociology, that's been recanted of. In some sense, at least in North America, 9/11 was a kind of sign that you couldn't assume that there was less religion around the world, that religion actually was mobilizing a lot of different actions. And yet we do see our classic religious institutions are weaker, but the temptation is to assume that this is a secular two issue. Just to give you one other way to think about this before we move into secular three, it is helpful to think about these seculars because you can get clear about certain statements that I think are helpful. For instance, I could make a statement that says, the United States of America is the most secular of all the Western countries. Now, that statement would be true, but only in one way of viewing the secular. What I mean by that is if your view of the secular was secular one, a public-private divide, to say the United States of America is the most secular of all the Western countries would be true in the sense that in the American Constitution, the bone between the church and the state breaks clean. So for instance, that doesn't happen in England. Charles is the head of the church. That bone between the public and private is not broken clean. Now, if we meant secular too, however, fewer and fewer people are going to church. If that was how we viewed the secular, to say the United States of America is the most secular of all the Western countries would be incredibly false. Because more people report going to church in America than for sure in France or the Scandinavian countries or the UK. So this really depends on how you think about the secular. I want you to recognize that. And around secular one, I also want you to see the kind of the subtext of this is that a lot of this is being built off of political philosophy. So when you think about secular one, public-private divide, and secular zero, if we found out that the dukes or the queen was doing witchcraft, we're all screwed. We're all in big trouble. Our whole society has a problem. In secular one, what the public-private divide does, and I would imagine this is very true in New Zealand, it's true at a local level in the United States, though oddly at a federal level it's not, but when there's a public-private divide, we start to say things like, our politicians, our mayor. We start to say things like, I don't care what the mayor believes. All I care is that the garbage gets picked up. What I care is that the water is clean. I don't care if the mayor believes in the Nicene Creed or not. In secular zero, if we find out that the queen crosses her fingers every time she says the Nicene Creed, the devil's going to come for us all. Now we start to tend to assume in a modern society, well, what an individual politician. The people who lead our societies, what they believe, we don't care about. What we care about is what they do, not what they believe. I said America's weird because we still think that at the federal office it matters what they believe. But even in the states, we don't really care what the mayor believes. We just care that the garbage gets picked up on time, that the water is clean. But you see a very kind of different imagination of how this functions. So I just wanted you to see how that plays out, those differences between secular one and secular two. Now this is where secular three comes in. So what is actually secular three? Or we could say, what does it really mean to live in a secular age? I think it is secular three. So if you can keep all these things in your head, what then is secular three? Secular three is this. Secular three is living inside the conditions of all belief becoming contested. Or another way of saying this that's maybe a little bit more poetic, That when you live in secular 3, you live in the conditions of all belief becoming fragile. That we live in a time where all forms of belief become fragilized. This becomes the condition of what it means to live in a secular age. And by that I mean what we are very aware of is that there are people who live across the street who are living very similar lives to our own, who believe something very differently than us. And for the most part, they seem to be doing okay. They actually go to all of their kids' sports events, and you don't go to all yours. Or they get their garbage cans in right after the garbage man comes. Does that happen in New Zealand? It takes you like 4 days to get your garbage cans in. Like they believe something very different than you, and they, for the most part, seem to be living okay. Or we're actually very, very aware that we could decide we don't believe what we believe now, and we could keep not all of you in this room, but most people in your churches, they could keep their jobs. They could continue on with life. They could decide they believe something very differently, and that wouldn't change much of their lives. That there's this deep sense that we live knowing we could believe something very different than we do. And that leaves us into this condition of a kind of fragilization. Now, this fragilization has both a positive and a negative to it. But I want us to be careful here because I don't want us to see that as like there's a good thing and there's a bad thing. There's the Facebook thumbs up and the Facebook thumbs down. I don't know, is there a thumbs down on Facebook? There's just an angry face, and then you just say terrible things in the comment at that time. Yeah, but there's, I don't want you to think of this as a good thing and a bad thing. When I say there's a plus and a minus, I want you to think of it like a battery, where a battery has to have both the plus and the minus to get the remote to work. That's all I know about electrical engineering right there, is that you have to have the plus and the minus of the battery lined up. But in this kind of secular 3, the minus of the secular 3 is that inside a secular 3 age, transcendence as an overall meaning system. Or think about it this way, the idea that there is a living God who speaks and moves throughout history. It becomes more and more unbelievable to people. And not even as a statement of confession. Not even as a kind of atheist statement, pound on the table, I don't believe this. It just kind of evaporates. Like people can live their lives and forget there's a God in many ways. Or we can hear things, I don't know if this happens in New Zealand, but in the States you could hear this. You could be at a coffee shop and you could hear someone say, yeah, I was going to this church for a while, and then things just got weird. And then I've just decided, I just have decided I need to take a break from God for a while. I just need to take a break from God. And you could overhear this at a coffee shop, and you could even be an ordained minister, and you could think to yourself, makes sense to me. I get that. I totally get that. But again, if a medieval person could listen through a wormhole of history and hear someone, a late modern person, say, I'm going to take a break from God for a while, they'd be like, that's the most incoherent statement they could ever imagine. It'd be like you saying you're going to take a break from breathing for a while. It's just not conceivable. But for us, it's very conceivable that we could take a break from God for a while. Or I know students, I know many pastors in the North American context who would say, in a moment of honesty, they'd say things like, if I'm really honest, I haven't thought about God in months. I mean, I've written a sermon every month, but I haven't really actually thought about God. I've been just kind of going through the motions. So one of the elements of this kind of secular age, secular 3, is that transcendence as an overall meaning system. This idea that there's a living, speaking God moving throughout history just becomes more and more unbelievable to people. The positive element, again, the plus on the battery, is that yet inside this reality, people feel an absolute necessity. They feel a yearning within them to have to construct meaning for themselves, to have to find their purpose. And this creates a very strange kind of secular age that I think resonates in New Zealand as much as it does in North America. It creates the kind of secular age that is filled with a surplus of spiritualities. Everybody wants to be spiritual. That people are looking for spirituality. Tell me if this isn't true in New Zealand. But in North America, you could go up to someone. Again, you could be in a coffee shop. You could go up to someone and say, hey, I've been noticing you from across the room, and I've noticed you are a very spiritual person. Most every American would go, Boy, thank you. I really am a spiritual person. Thank you for seeing that. Spirituality really means a lot to me. No one finds it insulting to say, I've noticed you're a very spiritual person. Now go up to that same person and say, I've been noticing you from across the room, and I've noticed you are a very religious person. They might go, wait a minute here. What are you talking about? What does that mean? But spirituality seems to be quite a good thing. So in this kind of secular age, you end up getting a surplus, an almost buffet, if you will, of all sorts of different spiritualities people have. But what happens inside of this kind of secular age is all those spiritualities become relativized. And by that I mean they all become equalized. So people will say things to you as pastor, as minister, will say like, well, it's great that you lead a church and stuff, and that must be great. And I'm really happy that people in your church, that works for them. But I don't need that, because all I do is take my dog on a walk every Sunday. And for me, just walking my dog that's my church. That's all I need. All I need is to be in the woods, and that works for me. Or they'll say things like, I was part of a church for a while. I mean, I was in an alpha group for a while. But then I got really super into like CrossFit, and then I started to do that. And then I was running marathons for a while, and that was my church. Like that really worked for me. But then I found this really interesting kind of guy on YouTube who was talking about UFOs and how we're all just really aliens from another planet and stuff like that. And that really opened my mind a lot. And then and so on it goes. And this is what one thinker calls a nova effect. He says what actually happens in our modern time is that we find ourselves in a nova effect. And what he means occurs is that organized forms of religion that all of us in this room in one way or another represent hits a kind of self-expressivism of one's desire to find authenticity and find their own purpose and meaning. And that creates kind of like a star, a bunch of gravity, and it ends up exploding, particularly after the late 1960s and on it's gone. It explodes into a surplus of third-way options. And so it creates an environment of spiritualities, and people are very happy to be spiritual. Not so sure they want to be religious, but very happy to be spiritual. And they feel like they need it because it is on their own shoulders to find meaning and to find purpose. And spirituality becomes very helpful for you to find your significance, your importance. It also really helps when you're living in a very competitive, late-form capitalism where everything is dependent on your performance and your continued competition with everyone. It really helps with all the road rash of all the competition to have a little spirituality to help you get through the stress and maybe the acute stress within that. So again, this is a very odd kind of secular age because it creates all these spiritualities while it makes a living, speaking God in the cadence of kind of classic Judeo-Christianity makes that very unimportant, maybe unnecessary, and yet spirituality is there. Now, I just was saying, I was drawing on a thinker who talks about this nova effect. I'm actually referring to the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. I don't know if you know the name Charles Taylor, who in 2007 wrote this big, thick book called A Secular Age. I tell my students it's the first philosophy book, I think, written in the 21st century that will be read in the 22nd century. I think it's that important of a book. But it is a big, big book, 770 pages. It is the perfect book to keep your door open on a very windy day. Like, it will do it. It will do the work. And if you don't like the person you're sharing an office with, if this falls off the shelf, it will concuss them. So if you need an alibi murder, this is the book to do it with. But the crazy thing about this book, 770 pages, he only wants to answer one question with 770 pages. And even the crazier thing about that is he wants to answer one question with 770 pages. The question is basically what I've been taking you through. He says, why in 1500, in any society in the West, and this is the other thing about the 770 pages, he only wants to answer one question for one part of the world. He's not saying globally. He's just saying for the West. Those he calls the leftovers of Latin Christendom. So those of our societies that find some kind of connection back to the western part of Christendom. He says, why in those societies, in the year 1500, if we use just big round numbers, if you lived in one of those societies, was it nearly impossible to live in those societies and not believe in God? Why? And he says, what has happened in the short 500 years where this is completely flipped? And in most places across these kind of these Western societies, it's flipped. And now in most places, it's easier to not believe in God than to believe in God in a short 500 years. It's like, what happened here? Now I'm really making a big pitch for this book. Here's the even crazier thing about it. 770 pages, one question, one part of the world. I hate to tell you this, but you have to basically read it at least 3 times before it starts really making sense to you. But some of us keep reading it over and over again and are at like 8, 9, 10 times because he says really interesting things. And this is why it takes 770 pages. And one of the things he says is things kind of work both ways, and I think this is very insightful for us. He says this kind of fragilization, he says it's a two-way fragilization. He says it's a two-way fragilization. So it's 770 pages because it's never straightforward. So it's a two-way fragilization. He says it works like this. He says if you're someone who believes in this kind of secular age, if you're someone who believes, and he would count himself this way, committed, practicing Catholic from Quebec, he said if you're someone who believes, you can't help it. You just can't help it. That if you're someone who believes, you're going to have a moment where you find that belief fragilized and you're going to be thrust into doubt. There's no way really to live in this cultural context and not be thrust into moments of doubt. So you're going to believe, but then you're going to have these moments where you think to yourself, ooh, is this true? Or is this just the family I grew up in? If I would have grown up in another family, another part in the world, would I believe this? No, it's true. And you go on. And he says, but then it will happen again, and you'll find yourself fragilized. And you'll think, religion, is it true? Or is this all just an evolutionary trick? I mean, is all religion is just kind of false pattern recognition all the way down? No, I believe it. His point is if you're someone who believes, the conditions of secular 3 is you are going to have moments where that belief becomes fragilized. So people in our congregations who show up on Sundays are people who are moving in and out of fragilization. It's just part of the environment of what it means to live in this kind of secular age. But what's fascinating, he says, it works the other way as well. It's two-directional. So he says, let's say you're a young person. You live in Auckland, and you're, doing your thing, and you've traveled the world, and you even did a degree at an advanced university, and now you're kind of hanging out and working on your music and getting an app going, and you've read everything. And come on, religion? You know what religion is. I mean, all religion is a historical reality used by powerful people to keep other people down. And when you die, you go to heaven. Grow up. Get over yourself. Your life, it's like a TV set. It's on. It's happening. Things are going on. You die. It's like unplugging the TV set. It just goes blank. It's over. It's off. It's done. That's what happens. What you believe, Taylor says, is that you don't believe. That's your belief. He says if that's you, that who you are is what you believe is that you don't believe. He says you too will have a moment where you find your unbelief fragilized and you'll have moments of believing. That's the conditions of this kind of secular age. So for instance, your sister says you have to come and hear your nephew's Christmas concert. And for you odd Kiwis, that's in the middle of summer. And you have to come and hear a Christmas concert, so you have your shorts on, and you're ready to go off to this Christmas concert. You don't want to go. I mean, come on. You don't want to go hear your nephew at some Christmas concert. Your sister just keeps getting on you. Come on, you got to come hear it. You finally go. You have a couple drinks before going at happy hour. You're just thinking, I got to keep my sister happy. Christmas is coming. I just don't need any fighting. You get there. You sit in the back of the concert hall, and it starts. It actually is a Bach concert. Boom, boom, boom. And it starts, and all of a sudden you feel it. That music hits you, and you feel something reach for you. And you feel like there's something bigger, that this beauty just overwhelms your sensibilities, and you feel like there's some kind of heartbeat of meaning and significance, and it's beckoning for you. You feel it calling for you. And you have this moment where your unbelief is fragilized, and you have a moment of believing. Or we know other ones empirically, where people will say things like, come on, you think your life has some purpose to it? Come on. Get over yourselves, people. Do you understand how massively huge this universe is? Do you have any sense of it? You can get no sense of it. It is so huge, this universe, that you think that your life on this teeny piece of dust of carbon, you think your life in your lifetime that doesn't even show up as an eyelash in the history on this planet that isn't even that old in the expanse of the universe, and you think your life matters, that you have purpose? Come on. We are just floating carbon. Your life has no purpose. That's what you think. That's what you believe. And then you have your first child. and you pick that baby up for the first time, and she grabs for your finger, and something else grabs for you. And you feel like it, you don't even know how to make sense of it. You feel like you've known her forever. Like somehow you were born just to care for her. And Taylor's point is you have a moment where your unbelief is fragilized, and you have a moment of believing. Or one more. You get word, and you've known this for a while, that your mother's been sick. But you get word, almost to your shock, that she's died. And you couldn't get back in time. You didn't know that her health would unravel like it did, but she's dead. You make arrangements, you fly home, you rent a car, you're there for the funeral, you're there for the burial. Your cousin who lives in town is nice enough to allow you to stay at his place. After the burial, you spend late that night talking about your mom and remembering her. Your siblings are there, your cousins are there. You're remembering your mom, telling stories. You cry, you laugh some, you cry more. Your brother tells a story. He says, remember how when Mom would clean the kitchen, she would always be sweeping, and she would do that dance, and then that 80s song would come on, and she would sing into the top of the broom. And remember how embarrassed that made us when we were teenagers and how much we hated it? And now you just wish you could watch her do that again, and that makes you cry, and you laugh at what she used to do, and you cry some more. Well, you stayed up pretty late. You go to bed, and you have an early flight the next morning. And you've been up too late, and you sleep past your alarm, and you wake up and realize you got to get to the airport, and you got to go fast. So you throw your clothes into your suitcase, you race out to that rental car, you start it back out of the driveway of your cousin, and you've left the radio on. And there it is, on the radio, that exact same 80s song. And you have a choice. You can think to yourself, oh my gosh, Jeffrey Bezos is listening to everything we say all of the time. Unplug the Alexa. You can think that. That is a legitimate way to respond in this kind of secular age. To just assume anything uncanny and weird is just, must be the algorithm, it must be something. Or you could wonder, is there something bigger? Is there something beckoning to me? This is the kind of conditions of what it means to live in this kind of secular age, Taylor thinks. But regardless, he says, whether we're someone who believes and finds our belief fragilized, or we're someone who doesn't believe and finds our unbelief fragilized and have moments of believing, he says, regardless, one of the things that we all share is that we all live inside what he calls an immanent frame. And he says this is what it means to be a human being. Human beings are always interpreting creatures. We always have to interpret our surroundings. And we usually are given lenses in which we interpret. And usually those lenses are given to us by the culture we're in, the way we're educated, the kind of family we grow up in, the institutions we live within. And the way that our lenses are as modern people is we tend to view things through a lens of immanence, he says. And this is what he says about immanence, or what he calls the immanent frame. There's a picture of Charles Taylor, a nice old man you'd like to give a hug to. He says this, he says, the immanent frame is a constructed social space that frames our lives entirely within a natural rather than a supernatural order. It is a circumscribed space of the modern social imaginary that precludes transcendence. All right, now it has been scientifically proven that philosophers' quotes have tryptophan in them. Do you know what tryptophan is? This is the thing, the chemical that's in turkey. This is why when Americans have Thanksgiving, they always fall asleep on the couch after, because they get sedated by all the turkey. And so I think philosophers' quotes have that chemical in it. So if you are struggling with insomnia, pull out your phone, take a picture of this, and just read it over and over again before you go to bed, and you will fall into a deep sleep immediately. But you start to pick up what he's saying. He's saying, back to our secular zero people, they lived with a frame that was more supernatural. They would presume something weird, something uncanny happens. Let's say one of these TV sets falls from the wall. Let's not hope that happens. But if one of those TV sets fall from the wall, if we were living through a supernatural frame, we would presume God's trying to tell us something. The devil's trying to interrupt this. For most everyone in this room, my guess is if that TV set fell, we would think, who put this TV set up? Who failed on that? Or we would wonder, how many years does it take before the metal in bolts gives way? We would presume that there's some natural material answer to this before we would go to the supernatural, where our ancestors would presume supernatural before natural. So we all share this kind of imminent frame, is what he's saying. Now, philosophers' quotes are great, but what I need are pop stars' lyrics to help this make sense. All right, at first that seems like, wow, this guy is cool, pop stars' lyrics. Except the lyrics I'm going to show you are like 14 years old. But I want you not to pay attention to that. Just think I'm cool. I need it. I'm jet lagged. Come on. All right, so this comes from the British, these lyrics come from the British pop star Lily Allen. Do you guys remember the British pop star Lily Allen? Some of you do, yeah. And you're scoffing because you're like, isn't she retired? Don't pay attention to how old these are. Just go with me on here. So if you remember Lily Allen from when you were in high school, so Lily Allen is very poppy, right, but also very irreverent. So it's very kind of poppy with middle finger waving in your face. So she had this song called The Fear, which I think is interesting, and you get the vibe of it here. She says, life's about film stars and less about mothers, but it doesn't matter because I'm packing plastic, and that's what makes my life so effing fantastic. All right, I have to tell you, folks, I have no idea what any of that means. Like, I have no idea what packing plastic means. I think it's very dangerous to try to exegete a pop star's lyrics. So I am not sure what packing plastic means. It probably means she has a credit card with a major credit limit on it. Probably more than likely it means she's had one part of her body medically enhanced, and that has become the measure of the good life. But you get the vibe here, right? You get this vibe going on, very irreverent. If you could hear the tune, very poppy. But this is the lyric I want you to see. She says, now I'm a weapon of massive consumption. It's not my fault some programmed to function. Now here it is. Now I'm not a saint, but I'm not a sinner. Now everything's cool as long as I'm getting thinner. Now, I'm not a saint, but I'm not a sinner. Now, everything's cool as long as I'm getting thinner. This is obviously very irreverent. It's supposed to be kind of middle finger in your face, but it also illustrates very well the imminent frame. I mean, essentially what she's saying is not once, not one time has she woke up in the middle of the night and been overtaken by fear and thrust into a cold sweat wondering, am I a saint or am I a sinner? Am I bound for heaven or am I bound for hell? What does God think of me? How do I avoid God's judgment? Will God have grace and mercy on me? She hasn't thought about that. Now, that's really fascinating because, well, within at least Northern European history, that was a big question that changed the world. I mean, the patron saint of my theological tradition, Martin Luther, woke up in a cold sweat many times wondering, am I a saint or am I a sinner? Am I bound for heaven or am I bound for hell? What will God's judgment mean against me? How do I avoid God's judgment? I mean, he couldn't sleep. When Luther went into the Erfurt monastery, he could not sleep. He'd be overcome with this fear. There's a story that Luther once went to his confessor when he was a young monk, and he confessed for 6 straight hours. 6 straight hours. Now just think about how long that is. That's 2 Lord of the Ring movies. For 2 Lord of the Ring movies, he confessed his sin. And then the story goes that he left the confessional, thought to himself, I feel so unburdened. I actually feel good. And then thought to himself, maybe it's bad to feel good. And he went back and tried to start confessing over again. And his confessor said, listen, Marty, you got to go out and do some stuff before we can do this. I mean, the guy was exhausted. But Luther could not sleep, wondering if he's saint or sinner. One of his great theological breakthroughs, one of his most constructive theological perspectives was called his simul, where reading Romans again, he realized it's not an either or. It's a both and. You are simultaneously both saint and sinner, and God's grace comes to you in the movements between saint and sinner. And at least for some Northern Europeans, that doctrine was a balm for hundreds of years, all the way up until 2012 in this British pop star. All right, we're not going to give her that much credit. But she does illustrate something. She says, not once. Not once have I woke up in the middle of the night and been overtaken by fear like Luther, thinking, am I a saint or am I a sinner? I have lost no sleep wondering about that question. But what's fascinating is I bet she's lost a lot of sleep. I bet she's woke up many times in a cold sweat, overcome by fear. As we'll see in the chorus of her song, she says so, overcome by fear. It's just that its referent is not a God who is holy and just, who judges and brings life and death. It is, well, swimsuit season's coming. What are people going to think of me? So it's not that she avoids anxiety, angst, even as the existentialists would say. It's not even that she avoids guilt. She feels it. It's just that its source is immanent and natural material, not transcendent and divine. Now, I don't know if this is true in New Zealand, but it's definitely true in America. There was this sense, and it went back to the early Enlightenment, and went back to certain kind of Freudianism. There was this sense that if we could just get these priests, these pastors, off of our backs, and we could exercise that perspective from our cultural imagination, we would be free from guilt. We could have a society free from guilt. I mean, Voltaire, the French philosopher, thought this. If we could get these overweening priests away from us, we would never have to feel guilty again. Freud did teach us that if we could just move beyond some of this repressive forms, particularly his students thought this, that we would be free from guilt. Now, if you hang out with upwardly mobile middle-class Americans, you will find a group of people who are overwhelmed with guilt. They feel guilt all the time, everywhere. They are riddled with guilt. It's just that the guilt is not because they have broken God's command. The guilt is, well, they let themselves down. They could have done more. They could have started that business, but they weren't brave enough. They could have started exercising years ago, and now they just haven't. They could have started the business, but they didn't. They could have started that podcast, but they didn't start that podcast. They had that other podcast idea that they could have started a podcast, but they didn't. They had that third podcast idea that they could have started a podcast. All right. I keep trying that joke all the time. It rarely works, except some people giggle. You know, they say everyone has 3 ideas for a podcast, and I just want to inform you all, we're done. We don't need any more. We have enough podcasts, so find something else to do. But everyone has this, like, I could have done this, but I let myself down. And so the guilt becomes, you can see this how this works in the immanent frame, that people do feel guilty. It's referent, is that they have let themselves down. It's natural material. And you do wonder, what's more liberating to live under? What's even more humanizing to live under? To live under the strictures of a God who judges and then gives us means of grace, of reconciliation, and forgiveness, or for me to be guilty to myself, by myself, that has to forgive myself for letting myself down and has to be more for myself so I can free myself from the guilt I feel because I couldn't be all I should have been as a self. I mean, you talk about being caught in a cycle there. But you see how the immanent frame kind of functions. As it functions, as she says, that it's this natural material that kind of falls on her. And yet, she does ask these big questions. Inside the immanent frame, she asks these questions of how to find meaning inside doubt. So Taylor says this, he says, we can't help looking over our shoulders from time to time, looking sideways, living our faith in a condition of doubt and uncertainty. And this is the fear that Lily Allen feels. So you get these very irreverent verses. I'm a weapon of massive consumption. It's not my fault, so I'm programmed to function. I'm not a saint, I'm not a sinner, but everything's cool as long as I'm getting thinner. But then you get this chorus where she says, I don't know what's right or what's real anymore. I don't know how I'm meant to feel anymore. When do you think it all becomes clear? Because I'm being overtaken by the fear. A kind of deep yearning inside of this kind of cross pressure. All right, what I should do now is play the song for you, right? Talked about it enough, we should actually listen to the song. Well, that would be too obvious. I don't want to do that. So but I do want to play a song for you. I think we need a song here after lunch that will maybe land this a little bit. But I want to play a song for you that comes from an independent band. Now, that is a life hack that you all should remember. Because if you're ever in a room and you want to be perceived as cool, or dinner party, you can't talk about those 4 things, but you want to be perceived cool, just say, I've been listening to an independent band, and automatically people have to think you're cool. It's written into the metaphysics of the universe. So I want to play a song from you from an independent band. That makes me sound cool, but actually, after all the shade I threw on Canadians, it was a Canadian who pointed this song out to me. And so this song comes from a band called Purple Mountains. Has anyone heard Purple Mountains? Okay, good. Now I'm cooler than all of you in this room because now I reference a band none of you have heard of before. So this is a band called Purple Mountains, and I want to play a song for you called Margaritas at the Mall. Now, 2 things you need to know about this song. You're going to hear the song. You'll see the lyrics come up. And so this is your assignment. Listen to the song. about 3 minutes. Make note of what lyric you find interesting, and then I'll ask you to discuss it with someone next to you. So that's your assignment. But 2 things you need to know before we go into this. The first thing to know is this is the singer-songwriter who is kind of oversees this band is also a poet, which I'll reference later, and his name is David Berman. And what you need to know about David Berman is he's not an old youth group kid. Never spent any time in a church, actually grew up in a Jewish but never went to synagogue. He's never been really part of any religious community ever before. And yet you're going to hear some deep, deep belongings within this. The second thing that you need to know about this song, and this is, I just have to apologize to you. This song, he sounds a little bit like Johnny Cash, which I'm not going to apologize for. That's cool. But what I do have to apologize to you for is this is an incredibly catchy song. So like 3 weeks from now, you're going to be unloading the dishwasher and humming margaritas at the mall. Or if you are of age to use the bathroom in the middle of the night, you're going to be walking back from the bathroom and you're going to start humming margaritas at the mall, and you're going to curse my name for this brain worm that has gone into your head. But what I want you to do is when that happens, when this song is caught in your head 3 weeks from now and you remember it in the middle of the night, I want you to stop and I want you to pray. And I want you to say, God, are you telling me now to go onto Amazon and buy an Andy Root book? All right, I'm just totally kidding. But I can always tell the pietists in the room because they all of a sudden lean forward like, please tell me to pray, tell me something. So that was a complete consumer joke. I mean, you do not have to do that. All right, so here it's going to come. Make note of which lyric jumps out to you. This is me. You may need to turn up the volume on this one. All right, so just take 1 minute and turn to someone next to you, and what lyric jumped out to you? So just 1 minute. So if you're an introvert, this is where you can pretend for 1 minute you have to take a phone call and just be back in one minute. All right?
Amy wants me to do the full thing, so I'll read that
So
from here and
what? Okay.
to me. Just
Okay.
hand it off.
Okay. And hey, Abby. Hey, what time do you want it to be finished?
We need to kind of be done by about 3.
By 3. Okay. And you need.
Are they half hour meeting?
Okay. I'll go about 20 minutes to a half an hour, and then and then turn it over to you, and then.
Okay, so we'll be done.
Yeah. Okay. Is that okay? So I'll have my 2:15 will be my drop dead. All right. What lyric jumped out to you? Any lyric? 49. The happy hour? Because you need happy hour, or because yeah. What's that? Ashamed. Ashamed to be alive. Yeah, very, very fascinating line. He says that pretty close to trotting the ground of the visible with no new word from God. How long can the world go on under no new word from God? Interesting. Very, very interesting.
The 50 gates, but 49
Are closed. Yeah. There's more closed. Right. Yep. 50 gates of understanding, 49 are closed. I think one of the really fascinating pieces of this is that really, if we want to call it this, one of the great accomplishments of the West, of the kind of way we've been looking at it, the great accomplishment, and we need to see this as a construction, as an accomplishment. Doesn't mean it's been, yay, great, but it is something that had to be created. What the West has created is not societies where there is no God. Most people, even in France, in Scandinavia, probably still in New Zealand, when asked, do you believe there's a God, still check yes. But this God has become quite subtle, a kind of very subtle reality. And that is a great accomplishment. And again, I don't think great, like gold star, way to go. But it has been something that's had to be created. And in many ways, the legacy of the West is to try to give the world a very subtle God. And what you get in replace of a quite frightening God that speaks, that judges, that lives, is, well, I mean, in place of that, you get a subtleness, and you get margaritas at a mall. And the question that this young songwriter, I think, is raising is that enough? Is that enough? Is there enough meaning here that what I'm supposed to just do is keep myself tipsy on margaritas to realize that I'm actually living in a void of not much meaning at all? So how long can this world go on under such a subtle God? How long can the world go on under no new word from God? I mean, just do remember, as we sit in here, and as all people of the early Reformation, for both Luther and Calvin, they knew how God acted. God acted as word. God's word comes. God speaks. The preacher, in humility, speaks God's word because God speaks as word. But what happens when there is no new word from God? Because everything is so subtle. And you just get happy hour that ends up being its own prison. Now, what's really fascinating, I think, at least in the context of American Christianity, is we spent, really since the late 80s through the 90s into the 2000s, really working to turn our churches into malls, to make them express a mall, because American Christianity, American Protestantism is a better way to say it, really thought that the issue was a secular II issue. How do we win market share? Well, one way you can win market share is get a margarita machine at your church.
Sorry, a coffee machine.
Well, that's it. That's often my joke is like I say, and people say, we just need to get a margarita machine. And then all the young adults will come. And then my joke always is, no one has ever actually said that, because if they did, I would go to that church if there was a margarita machine. But how many people, to your point, how many people have said to me, if we just had better coffee, then they would come. Now remember at the beginning I told you that if we're not clear on what we mean by the secular, even out of our best intentions, we may make matters worse. And this is it. That really our best intentions are to have people hear the gospel, to be in community. But when we think it's a secular issue, we end up, dare I say, drowning them in more imminence and putting them in even religious faith communities where God doesn't speak. And all you get in place is tequila-filled religious experiences that feel like a mall. And this is, again, the accomplishment of the West, is there's not much meaning in malls. There's not much meaning in just happy hour margaritas, but there's a lot of variety. So you just keep on having the different flavors and just keep going from one to the other, and that will just keep you from realizing that this is all quite flat. There's not much here. I really think that the task of the church and the task of the minister is not how can we win a little more market share? How can we get more people to come? How can you be a warrior that wins a little bit more participation? I think your bigger challenge, and it is a challenge, is how can you help your people and the people in your community hear the word of the speaking God again? How do we do that? And inside this imminent frame, that is no easy task. I do think to be a pastor, to be a leader in this time, means you should lose some sleep. That you should have some nights staring at the ceiling, wondering what is going on here, and like a prophet in the Old Testament, wondering why God has sent you. I think you should lose some sleep. But too often, I think, at least in my country, most pastors who lose sleep staring at the ceiling saying, why aren't more people coming? Why is that non-denominational church across town getting all the people? Why is my podcast no one listening to it? Or my sermon's not good enough to make me on this list of preachers? Or why am I so bad? That's usually where they lose sleep. I think you should lose a lot of sleep staring at the ceiling wondering, how do I help these people in this imminent frame hear God speak again? How do we shape our lives so we might live before the word of a living God? And that is hard, hard stuff. So let me give you a story that maybe lands this plane a bit, and then I think we'll have a little bit of time for some Q&A before we end our day in prayer, where we should. So to give you a story that maybe what does this look like? So a few years ago, I read this book that some of you maybe have read in here. It was an award-winning book by an anthropologist, an American anthropologist named Tanya Luhrmann. She writes under the name of T.M. Luhrmann. And she teaches at Stanford University. And she wrote this book called When God Talks Back. And what she wanted to explore, she's saying, like, across American society, there's so much division. There's a division everywhere. But she said there's one division that we haven't really explored, and that's a division across American society where there's a group of people, it's a small group of people, but they're there, who talk quite often of God speaking to them. God seems to tell them all sorts of things. And then there's a larger group of people who share cubicle walls with those other people who thinks anyone who says God speaks to them, well, that's a crazy thing to say. I mean, that actually may be a sign of low-grade schizophrenia or something. Like, that is just wacky to say that God speaks to you. So she decided she wanted to study that small group of people who says God speaks to them. So as a good anthropologist, she moved in with those people. So she joined a vineyard congregation in the third wave Pentecostal movement, and she joined a church for 3 years in the Chicago area, lived with those folks, got this job at Stanford, moved to Northern California, spent another 3 years with another vineyard congregation. So spent 6 years, and then wrote this book. And the end of the book is really quite beautiful and mesmerizing. She gets to the end and she says, can we say that people who say God speaks to them, can we say that this is actually just a mental illness? That this is kind of low-grade schizophrenia? Can we say that? She says, absolutely not. There's no correlations between people who hear God speak to them and a form of mental illness. Not as she experienced it inside these congregations. She said, well, then can we say that people who hear God speak, they're hearing God speak? She says, well, I'm submitting this book for tenure at Stanford and promotion. You don't get promoted at Stanford for saying God speaks to people, so I'm not going to say that. But then she says something more beautiful. She says, what I can tell you is that during researching this book, my father died. And these people prayed for me. And in the darkest days of my life, these people cared for me and they saw me through. It was beautiful. It was mesmerizing. But I thought to myself, well, that's interesting because, in a Pentecostal church, you say God speaks to you, people pat you on the back. You say that in a Presbyterian church or a Lutheran church, that God speaks to you, people don't pat you on the back, they step back. Like, they find that to be quite weird. So I thought, well, what would happen if I went and interviewed some people in some Presbyterian churches and Lutheran churches and asked them if God has ever spoken to them? So I did this thing called life history interviewing, where you just write up about 8 questions and you have an hour conversation with somebody and you record it with their permission and then you transcribe it and look for themes. So I asked all 12 of these people, I said, have you ever had an experience where you felt like God spoke to you? One of the gentlemen I asked was in his mid-70s, and I said, have you ever had an experience where God spoke to you? And he said, oh my gosh. Whenever anyone says God speaks to me, I don't trust those people. I feel like that's pure manipulation. I feel like they only say that because they're trying to manipulate me. No, I don't trust anyone who ever says God speaks to them. Except one time. Everyone at least had a one-time experience of God speaking to them. What was powerful is that most of those stories, and they were beautiful stories, were most often, I think every one of them, was a call into ministry. And I don't mean like, hey, go get theologically educated and become a pastor. I mean like the guy who said, I don't trust anyone who says God speaks to them. He said that one time he heard God speak to him, he was in his front yard, he was raking the leaves. His best friend who lived across the street for 40 years had just lost his wife to a long battle of dementia. He was so overcome with grief he couldn't get out of bed. He said he was raking his leaves and he heard God say to him, go to Gus and tell Gus this. It was a call to go care for someone else. All 12 of these people had an experience. They were incredibly moving. I asked them, I said, I felt privileged to hear them. I said, have you ever told anyone in your church this story? All 12 of them said, nope. Never told anyone in my church this story. I said, well, clearly you've told your pastor because your pastor nominated you to talk to me. So clearly you've told your pastor this story. All 12 of them said, nope. Never told my pastor this story. How long can the world go on under such a subtle God? I mean, this God is not subtle. This God is moving. And yet, somehow in our ecclesial life, in our congregational life, we've given no space, at least in my country, for people to testify to these stories, for the community to try to interpret these stories. Well, the story I want to share with you was the last one I did out of these 12. And it happened to be the youngest woman in my sample of people I interviewed. She's probably in her mid-30s. Her name was Rachel. She told me she had 2 children, and she kept on saying over and over again that she was a single mom. And she came into her pastor's office to be interviewed, and she looked like she wanted to be anywhere but being talked to by me. Like, she kept on saying, I'm busy, I'm a single mom, I'm really busy, I have these 2 kids, I'm a single mom. You could tell she was just there because her pastor asked her to do this, and she was just doing him a favor because she cared, and she was really appreciative of him, but she just wanted to get through this. She wasn't doing this, but she basically was. Like, let's get through this. If we can do this in 20 minutes instead of 55 minutes, that would be great. It was not going well, and I felt like it was not going well. I was out of questions, still had a few more minutes. So I decided to just throw one out there, to just heave one up and hope that maybe it would get her talking. So it was my last best chance, and we were running out of time. We had about 7 minutes left, and I finally said to her, I said, Rachel, have you ever had an experience where you felt so deeply ministered to that it felt like, or you experienced it as, the presence of Jesus Christ? Have you ever had that kind of experience? And her whole disposition changed, and she says, I have. She said, I've never told anyone this story. She said, I've been telling you I'm a single mom, but I haven't told you why I'm a single mom. She said, 4.5 years ago, my husband got on a plane in Seattle and he flew to Chicago. He was on a business trip. He was supposed to be gone 3 days. She said he was gone about 13 hours, and I got a phone call. And on the other line was a young man, and he said, hi, I'm calling. Hi, ma'am, I'm calling from the hotel your husband stayed at last night. So, ma'am, I'm calling because, and she said he just, all of a sudden, he was incredibly nervous, and he couldn't get his words out. And he said, hi, ma'am, I'm calling from the hotel. So ma'am, here's the situation. I'm sorry, I've never done this before. Let me start over. So, ma'am, so your husband stayed here, and so there's been a situation. She said he just couldn't get his words out. He said, so, ma'am, I'm calling, and so he finally stopped. She had no idea what was going on, and he finally said, ma'am, so I'm calling because, well, ma'am, your husband's dead. He said, our cleaning crew went into his room, our housekeeping crew, and found him unconscious in the bed, called the ambulance immediately. He said the ambulance got here, and they tried to resuscitate him, but they actually said he had probably been dead for hours, that he might have had a heart attack or something. Said my manager, this young man on the phone said, my manager is now dealing with this, but I was asked to call you and tell you the hospital morgue where they're sending your husband's body. She said as he finally got these words out, she couldn't make them compute. Like she couldn't make them make any sense. And then when they finally did make sense and kind of clicked in and she realized what he was saying, she said her first visceral experience was all the color being sucked out of the room. And she looked into the living room and she saw her preschooler and her kindergartner. And she thought to herself, her first thought, she thought, my life's over. How do I recover from this? She said she took out a business card and the young man on the line said, I need to give you the address. So she wrote the address on this business card, hung up the phone, called her mother to come stay with her children. She said she booked a flight from Seattle to Chicago. She said she got on that flight, and that flight lasted 5 minutes. It lasted 5 days. She said she was drowning in grief. She didn't even feel like her body was in time. She landed at the Chicago O'Hare Airport, went to the cab stand. She said she handed the cabbie the card of the address, and he drove. She said, I should have noticed this. She said, but I was drowning in grief, and I didn't notice anything. She said, I didn't notice he parked. But she said, I just wasn't picking up on anything. So she went into the hospital morgue. They had her itinerary. They knew when she was going to be arriving. They immediately took her to a side room. She said she stood there for about a minute. She said it felt like a day. She said this would be it. This would be the moment where this nightmare would become too real to even bear. She said he stood there for about a minute, and these doors open in the back of the room, and a gurney comes in with a body under a sheet, and this was it. The people from the hospital morgue pulled the gurney in front of her. The man grabbed the sheet to pull it back to reveal her husband's body. And she told me just as that was happening, she felt an arm on her shoulder. And she said an arm came around the front with a water bottle. And she started to cry. And she said to me, it was the cabbie. She says, it was the cabbie. And then she looked at me and she said, I never felt more ministered to. She said, I did not know how I would put my life back together. But I knew that God had not abandoned me. I knew that Jesus Christ was walking with me in this moment. And then she said the same words the 11 other people had. I've never told anyone that story. Again, how long can the world go on under such a subtle God? At the core, what the church is just a community that proclaims that the God who brings life out of death still moves and still acts. And yet I just worry we're too concerned about lost market share. We're too worried about just shoring up the loss of our resources. And again, don't hear me say that doesn't matter. It does matter. But it matters only for the sake to gather and proclaim to one another and to the world that this is a God found in Jesus Christ who takes what is dead and brings life out of it. This is a God who ministers new life to death. And what she needed is a community to be able to share that. And now I know nothing about that cabbie, like absolutely nothing. So this is all fictional. But I would say that cabbie, on the other side of the story, he needs a community like yours. He needs to be part of a church that he comes to the Tuesday night Bible study in a place where he can say, I got to tell you guys what just happened to me. I don't know how to make sense of it. I'm not sure what happened, but it felt like something profound. And then he needs to tell you the story. to your Tuesday night Bible study of misfits who are just there, and he needs to say, I was on my last run, working a 12-hour day. I'd worked all through the night. I had one more morning run, and I was going home. And this woman got in my car, and I kind of caught her eye in my rearview mirror, and I could just see just a deep sadness over her. And then I looked at this card she handed me, and I knew that address. Because when my cousin Ronnie had his heart attack at work, that's where they took him. And I remember my auntie throwing herself on the ground in grief when he died. And so I drove. He said, I should just drop her off. I was going to go home. I should have been going to bed. I said, I don't know what to make of it. I have no idea what to make of it. But I got there and I heard it. It must have been God. It must have been the Holy Spirit. I heard it. I heard the Holy Spirit say, don't leave her alone. Whatever you do, do not leave her alone. But I didn't know what to do. So I just walked in. And I just put my hand on her shoulder. And I was just with her. I don't know what to make of it. Feels profound, but I don't know what I did. I don't know if I did the right thing. Needs a community like yours that says, behold, you have been a servant of the Lord. God has moved. God has moved in our midst. At the core, I think, in this kind of secular age, that's what it means to be church. To bear those burdens with one another. To give a place for those stories to be shared. And to lean in and try to seek for a God who still speaks. A God who still moves in the midst of our lives and is anything but subtle. That this is a God who enters into death to minister life out of death. And that is a profound reality. Let me pray for us. God, thank you for these leaders. And thank you for their faithfulness. And God, however they leave this day, may they leave knowing that you are moving in their ministry. That you are well pleased with it, God. And that you beckon them to put their eyes upon you and the backwardness of your cross that brings life out of death. And to be ministers of the gospel is to minister life into death, knowing that you are the God who moves in just such a place. So we pray, God, for vision, for courage, and always for humility. Amen. So we are at 2:06. So we have about 10 minutes or so for Q&A or anything I've left still hanging out there, which I will say for some type A people, you're like, wait a minute, we never finished the diagram. And you'll wake up at 3 a.m. and then get really freaked out because you're like, we never finished. I feel like my life does not have completion now. So I'll finish the diagram for you. And we could, if you're around Tuesday when we have further conversation, we can unpack this. But it could just be that what it means in Secular 3 is how do you help people believe again through deep encounter. And the story I shared with you was a deep sense of kind of believing again through a deep encounter with the community and with a God who moves in the midst of this. So what I want to give you a chance to do is just take 1 minute if you want to. You don't have to talk to someone next to you, but just kind of gather any thoughts, and then we'll have about 5, 6, 7 minutes to tie up any loose ends, and then I'll turn it over to Kara to lead us through prayer and to give you your phone back to you. So just take 1 minute and just gather your thoughts, and then we'll have a few minutes for Q&A. Does that sound fair? Is that okay? Okay. Yeah, please.
As I was listening to you reflect on this, Andy, one thought that came to mind is, I think you're right that many of us now linger probably in secular 2, and that question of how do we participate in secular 3. But I'm also aware of people that I navigate in my own life, in my own parish, that still hang out in secular 1.
Yeah.
TV falls down, the Lord is saying something in that,
Yeah.
or the devil's not going to get a hold of me, and I wonder how this is probably too much for you to unpack, but how do you navigate that sort of complexity of actually we do still have some people that hang out in that secular 1, secular 0, and aren't actually in secular 2.
Yeah.
Because it's quite a unique.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So again, I want you to remember as these work that these kind of always are coming at us all at the same time. So there's not a kind of progression moving through, that they're all kind of within us at all times. So we're always kind of secular 1, but we also are always haunted by secular 0. Like that's still there within our cultural reality. So to pick up on that is to say, however, that some people's sense of a practical ecclesiology of how the church should function sometimes is it should be a place of demonstration, and sometimes it should be a place where we need more people participating. So that I think does play out. But it's a big question, and if people are around Tuesday, we can spend more time talking about this. I think I got that right on Tuesday. But it is a question of, are we really as disenchanted as we think we are? And I will say, in like the academic discussions around this is one of the major kind of pushbacks. There's some people who think like we've never really been disenchanted. The way consumerism works, the way college football in the United States works, it's basically a religion. I would imagine the All Blacks are essentially in a religion in some ways for some people. So maybe we haven't ever really been disenchanted. The way I tend to be on team, we are disenchanted within our structures. And one of the reasons I think that is not because I don't think there are these kind of noumenal, mystical experiences, but it's to say that we tend not to actually ritualize those. And you need to ritualize those experiences. So there are all sorts of individuals, like this woman I just shared the story with, who has this incredible experience. But what she really does need that we tend not to give to her is a community that holds that and even remembers that. So just like really quickly, we bought a house that was built in 1912, and we were only the second family to ever live in it. So like guy grew up in it, lived in it, died in it, like horror movie, died in it. Was like it was a wreck. A small real estate company bought it, tried to flip it. The market started to go down. We got in and picked it up. So we're the only second family, third owner, second family to live in it. When we moved into this house, weird crap happened. Like really weird stuff. Like we cleaned out old places and found like weird stuff. Like to the point where this is really Kara's story more than mine, but like one night she has this very strange experience, like Sixth Sense kind of experience of being pinned down by something, praying in the name of Jesus for it to leave. We then, like anoint we're not, those kind of, well, I don't know how to say this. I mean, I think I'm going to step in it right before I leave you all. But this is not, we're not demon chasers kind of people, but like there's something happened here. And we do believe that there was some kind of spiritual evil force. But what I will say, and this is why I think we're still disenchanted, we almost never talk about it, and we kind of forget about it. When we bring it up, sitting around with friends and start telling ghost stories, and everyone has a ghost story, I mean a kind of uncanny kind of story, but none of us really, it doesn't order our lives. And what I particularly mean is our church, there's no plaque on our front step that says on July 24th, 2006, Reverend Kara Root came nose to nose with the devil in this house. Or our church doesn't show up on that date and say prayers and remember when that happened. No one in our church knows that story probably. And so point being, we actually are two individuals that do think there's enchantment, that there are spirits, but the cultural reality we inherit basically says you have no place to share those stories, and that you have no rituals to commemorate them. And so they just become kind of fodder for 2 glasses of wine. You have 2 glasses of wine, you're like, hell, I had a really weird experience once. And then someone shares their weird experience, where the very difference of a secular 0 reality is those kind of experiences become commemorated, ritualized, and annually held on to. And they kind of perpetuate belief in that. And part of what this kind of Western secularization does is strip the meaning of those. Because part of it is to release you from the burden of having to have all these days of remembrance. But in some, and that feels like liberation. Hey, I don't have to every Tuesday or every 8 days have to remember this, but all of a sudden you have nothing. And now you're sitting on Christmas Eve and it just feels like another day. Charles Taylor does this where he's like, I'm not going to be able to do this well, I'm jet lagged, but like Good Friday in 2025 is closer to the original day of the resurrection or of the crucifixion than say July 15th. if that makes sense. Because it's not, you're thinking the holy day connects to the holy day. And so that time is connected because it's not just simply a linear unfolding, but we don't function that way. So we don't often think that like Christmas Eve or Good Friday is a substantively different kind of day. I think it's just kind of regular day, and if you can make meaning out of it and it works for you, but if you don't you wish McDonald's was open on Christmas Eve? Because you're just living another regular day. So there's like that infrastructure that I think works. I don't know if I completely got to where you wanted to go, but we'll get there Tuesday. All right. Anything else? I need to hand this over. We're right on 2:15. Well, this will be our last one.
You partly answered it then.
Yeah.
But what's your reflections on the 12 people and why they hadn't told their story?
Yeah.
And even from your story a little bit then, there's obviously something about our church communities that you say they need a place to share and we need a place to ritualize them.
Mm-hmm. So
give us the headline of why can't we do that in our current churches and what do we need to do to allow for that?
Yeah. So I think the reason we can't do it, I think I alluded to, but we continue to think about it, is because we feel like, in two frames, the vision of what is good. The perspective we take is always, I have a positivity in this sense about human action, that we're always trying to drive towards what's good. And so our view of what is good, what will make me a good pastor, what will make my congregation stable and good, we tend to then view in these imminent secular two kind of ways. So really, I care about hearing my people's story, but at the end of the day, I either feel for my own identity, I need to win some kind of relevance for myself as pastor, or I feel the burden that if things don't change, we are 2 years away from having to close these doors. And I don't know that I can live with being the pastor who shuts down this church. So what I really need to find is a way to innovate us out of this problem. And that is all fine and good, but if it is the drive over and against the people and their stories in our midst, we cut our nose off and despite our face. We may very well find new ways to create life and find innovation, but it has to happen because of the ways we're encountering each other and encountering our neighborhood and being beckoned into shared life that way. So at the other level of this, then what should we do? I think the reason we don't do this is because our sense of what will stabilize us as our own identities as pastors, as well as stabilize our congregation, ends up being this dynamic form of find more capital, whatever that might be. Cultural capital, financial capital, but you better find capital, because that's the only thing that makes your church long for the world. And only things that will be put on your tombstone, essentially, no one really believes this, but we feel this, is how much capital you've gained. So what do we do? This is going to sound incredibly pietistic, but I deeply believe it, is that somehow we have to see the church as a place that blesses the world by praying for the world, and that the pastor's job is to teach her people to pray. Now that seems incredibly pietistic, but it's the only way to open up the imminent frame. So if you like the words on the back, open, take, close, spin, this is Taylor's point, is inside an imminent frame, you don't get a chance. You cannot minister to people outside the imminent frame. Even our immigrant communities or our indigenous communities, because of the ways the institutions function, then there'll be ways of the imminent frame kind of falls on all of us. So it's really hard, nearly impossible to opt out of the imminent frame. But Taylor's point is inside the imminent frame, you do have a choice. You can live with it as a closed spin or open take. And prayer is the practice of staying open within the imminent frame. Open to one another, open to God. So we tell each other these stories as a form of prayer. We pray these stories, and these stories are our prayer. But the pastor's job ultimately, the leadership, even lay leadership, is to teach people to pray, which is the perfect segue to have Kara lead us into prayer.